and you work on teacher education and recruitment and trying to attract and develop the very best teachers. You've worked, as we know, with the Carter Review, and we welcome your recommendations that came up from that report. You worked with the DFE Expert Behaviour Management Policy and Ofsted Advisory Group, as well as the Curriculum Research Group as well, and a host of other things. You have a whole host of other involvements and responsibilities with schools and school alliances as well. And of course, you were named as an OBE 2 years ago. I'm very welcome that is to us all for the profession as well. So I know we are going to be informed, we're going to be educated, and we're going to be treated to Sam's insights into primary teacher education for definite. And supporting Sam today on that is Elaine Haywood, who's our NaPTEC secretary. So without further ado, may I introduce Professor Sam Twiselton. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Jonathan. I really must remember not to send through all that blurb about the university, because apart from anything else, it's quite boring and it makes me sound like I've got an ego the size of Texas, which I hope I haven't. Really, really nice to be here. I feel like I'm back amongst friends, having started my career as a primary school teacher. I love being at NaPTEC. Like James, I wish I was in Oxford. Hopefully next year you might invite me back again, and we can all enjoy being in a room together. So miss that. Just sorry, getting distracted by a message that came up on the screen. So I'm just going to attempt to share my slides, having very confidently said to an email, oh, I'm always sharing slides. It's only just now I realise I've never done it on Teams before. I presume it's this share content. Yes, good. So hopefully that has worked.
That's looking good. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you can see that.
Loud and clear. Thank you. Yes,
always a relief. So I really enjoyed, like everybody else, listening to James. James and I have worked closely over loads of things over the years, and I'm really glad that he was able to give all those, you know, how fantastically the sector has responded to COVID. I'm actually not talking about COVID at all today. I hope that's a welcome change for you all, but I am aware how incredibly dominant it is in everybody's lives. It's not that I'm ignoring it. It's just that Joe and I thought it might be quite useful just talking about, spend a few minutes talking about lots of, I think, positive and exciting things that are happening in the teacher development space that are nothing to do with COVID. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. It's kind of a quite wide-ranging set of things. And I'm aware some of you might have heard some of it before, so I'm going to try not to dwell too long on anything in case that is the case. But I'm going to start by talking about my research, which I have talked about a lot over the years, but I think it might, even if you've heard me talk about it before, be useful, just because I think it helps frame, certainly for me in my head, why I think some of the things that are happening, either have already happened or are about to happen, are good or could be good if the sector gets behind them. So my research was actually with primary student teachers many years ago now. Actually, they were all teaching English, but right through from reception through to year 6. The data was collected over a period of about 4 years. And the methodology was the same for all of them, even though in every year we made sure that the 20 or so that were looked at in that year had a range of people at different points on their courses, both undergraduate 3- and 4-year degree, and PGCE, but the methodology for them all, regardless of where they were on the course, was the same. And it involved observing them teach a lesson in school, and in a very old-fashioned way, just scribbling down everything they said and everything they did, as near to moment by moment as you could get. The idea being that we would then sit down with them straight after the lesson and record an interview that went into quite a lot of depth, usually took at least an hour, mainly going through those moment by moment notes, trying to unpick with the student teacher what was in their head when they said whatever they said or did whatever they did, and in particular what they were trying to achieve, whether they thought they'd been successful or not, but what they were trying, you know, what was the point in saying that thing or doing that thing. So these interviews, as I say, took over an hour, and then they were transcribed, and then as you do, you look through all that data for patterns and themes, and lots of really interesting things came out. But this is the bit that you may have heard me talk about before, because very early on in the study, we found that this kind of method of categorising, or probably more accurately thinking in terms of 3 points on a sliding scale, was really useful to crudely categorise each of the student teachers. So we found this early on, and it proved to be useful and consistent throughout the whole 4 years of collecting the data, that you could, looking at the kind of summary of all the reasons they gave for all the different things that they were doing at different points in the lesson, attribute them to one of these categories, or put them on a scale, somewhere on this scale. And I'll just give you examples of the different categories and the kinds of things that they would be likely to say if they were going to be putting in this category. So to be in the task manager category, you weren't talking about learning. So if you'd said a lot about learning, then you'd have automatically not been put in this category. You're talking mainly about tasks, getting things done. So whether it's a piece of writing, a worksheet, a game, a piece of reading, a story, whatever, the main thing was getting through that task, getting it done, and success really was that, having finished the task. That's why they were called task managers. I should imagine that you can relate to this, both in terms of student teachers that you support and observe when they're in school, but possibly I can certainly relate to it when I was learning to teach. I can still relate to it now, actually. Next category, the difference between being a task manager and being a curriculum deliverer was that they were talking about learning. But what put them into this category and not the final category, who also talked about learning, was the fact that a lot of the questions were very sort of probing in terms of, so why were you covering that thing? What was it you want, that thing that you said that you wanted them to learn? What was the point of it? Why did it matter? And they hadn't really thought in those terms. So usually their answer was along the lines of this quote here. It was in the scheme, it was in the school's planning, it was in the national curriculum. Increasingly, it was in the literacy strategy. That dates when the study took place. And they hadn't really thought beyond that. Somebody told them that they needed to cover it, so that's what they were doing. They were covering it, and that's all they'd thought about at this point, which was the thing that really made them stand out from the concept skill builders. And the concept skill builders were thinking like concepts and skills in terms of what they were trying to achieve. And very often they were the most self-critical, actually, because what they were trying to achieve was so much harder than finishing tasks or covering something. They wanted the children to be able to understand something, a concept, a skill, that they would be able to remember it, to apply it, to continue using it, to build on it, beyond that lesson, beyond that moment, and quite often even beyond that subject. And so the concept skill building was why we called them that, because they were thinking in those terms. Basically, they were thinking about learning that was going to be transformative and transferable, which is really hard, which is why they were so self-confident. They didn't feel like they'd been successful, even though actually if you'd looked at the notes of the lessons, you would have probably agreed with me. They tended to be a lot more impressive in terms of the range of strategies they were using, but they still felt they weren't being successful. And that's because A, it's really hard to develop concepts and skills, and B, it's really hard to know if you've done it. So you might have been successful, but how do you actually know? So just to kind of summarise then, so for the task managers, really for them, success looked like these kinds of things. Classrooms should be busy, but overarchingly, really importantly, orderly. Children should complete their tasks, and above all else, teachers should be in control. And I can still really relate to that. If you don't feel in control, if you don't think you look like you're in control, you can't think about anything else. So completely acceptable and understandable for lots of people to be task managers at certain points in their teacher training, particularly at the beginning, or particularly with a new class or in a new school or whatever. Then for curriculum deliverers, they are thinking about learning. What makes them different. But for them, learning is sort of dictated by someone else, whether it's in the national curriculum, class teacher, or whoever. And it's really hard, because maybe you've not thought about it like this, to give a reason why that learning is important beyond the fact that somebody's told you to cover it. And then for the concept skill builders, the subject, in this case English, and why it matters, the concepts and the skills are absolutely key. And those tasks are only any good if they're actually helping to develop those concepts and those skills. And that's quite often where they felt the lesson might have gone wrong, that the tasks weren't right or the curriculum weren't right for what they were hoping these children will be able to get from it. And so I should hope that you can kind of relate to this, and this will sort of resonate for you in terms maybe of some student teachers that you've spent time with, or as I say, maybe you've been thinking about yourself and your own practice. Many years later, this report came out, the Sutton Trust What Makes Great Teaching report, which I found really useful. It's very accessible, but with a lot of evidence underpinning it, and it really resonated with my data. Rob Coe talked about poor proxies for learning, and not only did it resonate with my data, but actually resonated with some of my practice as a teacher educator, particularly when observing students in school. Lots of things which look like they might be evidence of good practice, and there may be good things in themselves, but they can be there and they can be present, and there still can be no learning. They're actually poor proxies for learning. And so many of the things that the task managers were focusing on, children being busy, engaged, giving feedback, everything being ordered, calm and under control, sort of classic task manager kind of criteria for what they thought success was. Now, that's not to say these things don't matter. It might be these are conditions that you need in order to actually create the learning. But on their own, you can have all of these things in place and learning can there's no guarantee that learning is happening. Then the bottom half, I thought, worked quite nicely for the curriculum deliverers. And I think actually I really relate this to my own practice as a teacher educator, particularly when you're thinking about PGCEs. You've got so much to cover. Just covering it sometimes feels like it's all you can do, really. Have they really understood, or actually did they know it already? Will they remember it? Can they reproduce it? Not really sure. So you could be a curriculum deliverer, and it still might be the case that learning is not happening. It might be happening. It's not saying it won't be, but it's a poor proxy for being sure. So, as you do when you're doing research, you look around to see what other studies might link to yours and help you understand your own data better. So obviously there's loads of things we could talk about, but I'm going to focus on two. One is a study by Toshan and Mumby, which has quite a lot of similarity with, certainly with the methodology of mine. They particularly wanted to work out what the key difference is between people who are considered to be experts and people who are right at the beginning of their careers. They knew that there'd be lots of ways in which they would be similar. They very deliberately set out to find out what are the ways in which they're different. And so their methodology is very similar, observing them teach and then talking to them about it afterwards in terms of really trying to unpick the decisions they'd made at any particular given moment. And for the experts, they came up with this idea of synchronicity, synchronic way of using teacher time in relation to knowledge. And all that means is at any particular moment, what they found by talking to these experts, once they'd unpicked it and made it conscious, because a lot of it was unconscious initially, was in order to make the best decision about what to say or do, they were synchronizing knowledge from across a whole range of different knowledge bases. So yes, it mattered that they understood the subject well, but it mattered even more how to make that subject really accessible to the pupils in front of them. And in order to know how to do that, that's where you tap into all sorts of other things, the time of day, the weather, is there a global pandemic, are we worrying about social distancing, has somebody's cat just died, what have they done previously, what are the misconceptions they might already have, what are the things that are likely to hook them, that they're particularly interesting in their lives right now. All of those things that we know make all the difference as to how you make a subject accessible, this kind of pedagogical content knowledge. And so they were synchronizing from that wide range of different types of knowledge into any decision. Whereas the novice teachers, they're described as having this diachronic time epistemology. Diachronic is much more linear. So if you think of synchronizing as sort of taking from all over the place into one decision, diachronic is much more, I've decided that we're going to do A, B, C, D, E. So that's how I'm going to do it. So my decision making is based on that linear plan, much of which has been mapped out in advance. Now, that's exactly what we ask novice teachers to do. We know they need to plan things out in advance because there are so many variables that you do need to have control over, as many as you possibly can. But it makes for a much less rich teaching episode. That's what the kind of the study showed. They were kind of sticking to a script, but unfortunately we know children don't have one, and therefore once the children sort of varied a little bit in terms of their understanding and their responses, the novices were much less able to respond flexibly and therefore effectively in the way that the experts were doing. Next one I'm going to show you is Sternberg and Horvath. Some similarities with the previous one in that they looked at what it is to be an expert. So again, people considered by their peers to be expert, this time across a range of professions, including teaching, but not just teaching. And a bit similar to the last one, what they wanted to find out was, they knew that these people would be very different in many different ways, different according to their profession and just different as individuals. So they were aware of difference, but they were wanted to see, are there any ways in which they're the same or have similarities that they share that can then help us to come up with some kind of definition of what it is to be an expert. And they landed on these three things. Not rocket science, you won't be surprised by any of them, but I think quite helpful. So in order to be an expert, you obviously need to know quite a lot of things. What really interested me about what they had to say about this is that they found, though, it's not just about knowing a lot, it's how you know it, how that knowledge is organised in a way that means that you can access the most relevant for the situation in front of you, a bit like the Toshan and Mumby teachers. How do I make this subject accessible to these children, knowing what I know about them and knowing what I know about the context? So how it's organised, how that knowledge is accessible to you in a way that you can draw on the most relevant, which links very closely to the next feature, which is insight, your ability to look at a situation in front of you and work out quickly what are the most relevant things that you need to attend to. Now, in a busy classroom, there are so many things you could potentially attend to. You can't attend to everything. So having really good expert insight allows you to focus on the bits that are going to make the biggest difference to the potential of these children to learn. And that links very closely to the final category, which is efficiency. In order to do that, so many other things have to become so automatic that you don't have to think about them anymore. And learning to drive is the most useful analogy I tend to use here. So I can still remember the first time I sat in a driver's seat with my dad next to me, explaining about clutches and accelerators and bite points. And oh God, you know, the overwhelming worry about trying to remember all these things as you set off that first time you drive, compared to a few months later where you're changing gear and you're not even aware that you're doing it. We know that's what good teachers do. They have lots of things, lots of the things that were making the task managers and the curriculum deliverers taking up all their thoughts have become automatic by the time you're an expert teacher, which means that your consciousness is freed up to be able to really think on about that and focus on the higher order things about how to make this subject accessible to the children in front of you. So it seems at the time of the study, I found looking at the kind of psychology and the kind of notion of schema extremely useful. It seems to come back into fashion recently, which is helpful, I think, because schema. Oh, what's happened? Somebody else sharing their screen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you. Yes, I don't know what happened there.
It says someone else has started sharing, so I'll just try sharing again and see what happens. Yeah, nothing like a bit of technology to keep us on our feet.
Don't know
there we are. Can you see it again?
Yes, yes, we can see it, Sam.
Sorry about that, everyone. Oh, no, where was I? Yes. So, schema, if you like, I think relate to what Sternberg and Horvath had to say about how knowledge is organised. If you've managed to become efficient in lots of the kind of management, the task management and curriculum coverage things, to a point where you don't have to think about them that much anymore, your mental model has allowed you to be able to focus on the higher order aspect of really thinking about how to make concepts and skills accessible to learners. But that doesn't happen on its own. You have to really work hard at developing those schema. And I will come back to that in a minute, but I just want to kind of summarise the studies that we looked at, including the data collected in the one I'm talking about. What they all seem to have in common was to be really expert, or even to move towards being really expert, you seem to have to be able to iterate between, even if it's unconscious, a bigger picture understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve, the learning that you want to develop over time, not just in this moment, but learning that lasts, and the micro moment of the detail of what I'm going to do and what I'm going to say now. And it's that kind of iteration that is constantly happening. As I say, sometimes it's unconscious, sometimes it's conscious, but it needs to be there. So as I've sort of said as we've been going along, there's a sense in which I argue that these categories are sort of stages of development that student teachers sometimes, not always, go through. So there is a sense you're more likely to be a task manager near the beginning and hopefully edging towards being a concept skill builder towards the end. Of course, it's nothing like as neat as that. You could describe it more as a cycle, certainly very likely to revert to being a task manager with a new class in a new school, with a subject you feel less confident about, or just a new subject that you haven't got your head around yet. Very likely to revert to one if somebody walks through the door with a clipboard, because what you then become very aware of is all the observable things, which tend to be, are children engaged? Do I look like I'm in control? And it becomes more about task management than anything else. Curriculum delivery found you can get stuck here, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So you might go through a stage of being a curriculum deliverer and then hopefully come out the other end. But lots of reasons why you can just get stuck in constantly thinking about coverage rather than really that bigger picture stuff. And there's lots of external factors that can impact on the potential to get stuck there. What we found with being concept skill builder, obviously it's time and experience to some extent, but it actually can really be helped by sort of systematic opportunities to think about the bigger picture. And that's of course what good ITE courses do. That's the beauty of the model, where you can have that time away from the classroom to step back a little bit. But also, if you're in practice, you're being encouraged to talk about your practice a lot. If you're in a kind of school where that happens, not just in the formal observations, it's much more important really that it happens as part of the culture of the school, that you're reflecting on practice, that you're talking about it. And in particular, if you're helped to compare and contrast different approaches. This study took place in Cumbria, and some students had the opportunity to have a short placement in Scotland, just hopping across the border. Not that different, you wouldn't think, but it was actually really different enough to really make them stop and think. Slightly different curriculum, slightly different way of organising things, slightly different culture, really helped them to do that comparing, contrasting and critiquing, which makes you think like a concept skill builder. Of course, any attempt to capture anything as sort of complicated as learning to teach can never really be captured on a simple diagram like this. It's really important, I say that it's a tool to help us think rather than meant to be sort of some kind of definitive answer to this is how teachers develop over time. It's much messier than that, but it is quite useful, I find. I mentioned about the importance of external factors, and I also mentioned that the strategies came in halfway through this data was being collected, and we found that with the implementation of the strategies, compared to the previous year where it was the data was much more aligned to what stage of their course students were on, everybody became a curriculum deliverer in that first year. And I think this quote sort of says it all, really. Those of us who were around, I know, Joe, you were, that's how it felt. It was like a blinking steamroller. There were just too many things to think about. So you couldn't think bigger picture because you were just worrying, is it word, sentence or text level? Which bit of the hour am I on? Is it a plenary? Is it guided? Is it shared? And all of that. And that kind of resonated with something that Michael Arrow talks about as being routinization, the potential for there being so many things in busy classrooms to think about that you can't see the wood for the trees. You develop routines, and there's a danger the routines become ends in themselves. So there's a danger the curriculum becomes an end in itself, or that literacy hour clock, or whatever it is, and you're not able to, all you were doing is following the routine rather than thinking about what is the point of this routine, what was it set up to do. Much more likely to be a concept skill builder, and the school context really did make a big difference here. If you're in a school where people are talking about practice, reflecting on it, they're comparing and contrasting different approaches, absolutely brilliant. If they have the opportunity to go to a school that has a very different approach to the one that you're based in at the time, different approach to curriculum, different approach to behaviour or whatever, and really critique those approaches and ideally look at the evidence base. And that what that does is it regularly makes you think about the bigger picture. If you're interested in reading up a bit more, I've got quite a lot of journal articles from quite a long time ago, but the most recent publication that's probably worth having a look at is there's a link there in the Charter College journal. So as I've said, there's a sort of sense in which there's a kind of continuum here, although you have to treat it with caution. I've certainly found it useful over the years in terms of the courses I'm involved in, helping to develop what you need at different points and in helping other people to develop their courses. Of course, around that, you need to wrap all of these other things. So there's a sense in which you need to think about what do student teachers need at different stages in their development, but also what is a combination of different kinds of experiences, and really thinking carefully about how you tie up the school-based experience with the inputs they're getting away from the school in a way that they can really, really make those connections. I'm telling you what you already know, of course. I feel like I'm teaching grannies to suck eggs. But on the Carter Review, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, that was the thing that was most striking. It wasn't what's the content of the curriculum, it's how carefully you've crafted and sequenced that combination of those different experiences into that spiral curriculum, which means that you are spiraling up through those stages. So fast forward then from that study a long time ago to several years later, and an admission by this government at last that we have a recruitment and retention crisis, having been in denial about it for quite a long time. And it doesn't take long to find sort of headlines to show that, despite what James was rightly saying, recruitment has gone up recently, but we shouldn't need an economic crisis, for goodness sake, to have enough teachers. That's a really bad reason for people coming into the profession. We haven't got enough teachers, but we haven't got enough teachers because we're not holding on to the ones that we've got for long enough. And that's a real disaster. It's a disaster for everybody, but it's really bad for those parts of the country where you find the most deprived communities, places in South Yorkshire, where we have schools where more than half of the school are supply teachers or on temporary contracts, many unqualified teachers, many who don't have a degree in the subject they're having to teach, massive turnover at every level, from NQ2 right through to senior leadership. And those are the pupils who need the best teachers, and they are the worst impacted by this problem. Good news is that at last, I think the government is beginning to take it seriously. We could argue it could do a lot more, but I think what it is doing is sensible. And I'm just going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour. I just need to check and keep an eye on the time. Okay, I think of a few things I'm going to just touch on and then bring us right up to date with some quite exciting things that are happening now. So I'm going to go back to the Carter Review. I know I've talked to some of you who were here a few years ago about the Carter Review, and it's worth just reminding what it involved. It wasn't without its stresses, certainly for me being on the advisory group, and it felt like it could have been set up in a very ideological way. But actually, because I was released to work on it full time for about 6 months, in the end, it proved to be a really life-changing experience for me, simply because of the bottom half of that slide. All the different things that we did, all the different people, some of whom will be in this call that we spoke to, all the experts, all the providers, 31 visits. It was like a grand tour of teacher training. It was absolutely brilliant. Talked to loads of trainees, talked to loads of NQTs, RQTs, mentors, head teachers, and so on. It was absolutely brilliant. This is a little illustration, though. So this is these are the notes from one of the expert groups. We think we had about 12 of these altogether on different subjects. This is a subject knowledge one. You can see how many pages the notes ran to. This is a 2-hour meeting with actually subject associations and others telling us what you needed to know about subjects in order to be confident and competent by the time you became an NQT. And that's pages. If you could read it, you wouldn't disagree with it. But if you think that it's like 9 months, really, 2/3 of which is spent in school, postgraduate, obviously it's longer if it's undergraduate. How can we possibly ever cover all of this? Because this, times this by however many you want to. I think we had 12, but we could have had a lot more. It is absolutely ridiculous that we're expected to cover this stuff in any kind of meaningful way. And so that leads to kind of my reflections on what we found. I think we found some really good stuff. I'm still quite proud of the report and how it ended up. We saw lots of really good practice. I think it was set up by Michael Gove with the intention that we would find a scandal of how bad initial teacher training is in England, and we didn't. We found lots of really good practice, but inevitably inconsistencies, because how can you cover all of that stuff without making choices about which you will emphasise and which you don't. And so different people had emphasised different things. As I've said already, for me, what struck me, it wasn't really what was covered, it was how, and it was who, and it was where, and how often, and, you know, the extent to which you could see that spiralling, that building knowledge over time to a higher and higher level. That what struck me as being the most interesting thing. We also found that where you've got groups of schools involved in teacher training, and this could be university-led or school-led, didn't really matter, where you've got them really heavily involved in the ITE bit, with the view that they will then employ some of the trainees as NQTs and RQTs, they can really address that problem of 9 months is just far too short if you've done that course, by carrying on developing their employees and effectively extending initial teacher training. But the fact that that was there for some people, and it was so obvious talking to those NQTs how brilliant that was working for them and how much more satisfied and less stressed they were because they had that support, it really shone a light on the fact it wasn't there for everybody, and lots of people didn't feel they were being supported. Lots of them felt like they were expected to hit the ground running, have all these massive expectations on what they'd be able to know and do, when they just had that 9 months, and a lot of that content had really washed over. I mean, it really struck me. They came to Sheffield Hallam, the panel, so obviously I was wearing 2 hats that day, and we met with some of our NQTs to talk about behaviour, and we do loads on behaviour, and the number of them who said that they'd hardly done anything or couldn't really remember doing anything, it's, you know, devastating. But it's because it had washed over. You're trying to cover so much stuff. So it's not long enough, and it's not sufficiently joined up to early career support for everybody. That's what we said at the time. People didn't really pick it up from the report. We said it, but it's almost like as a sector, as a profession, we're so used to it. We all know it's a problem, but we just accept it and kind of get on with it. Fast forward then to, like I say, a few years later, the DFE recognising there's a problem. I was asked to join the advisory group for the teacher recruitment and retention strategy. The document itself was published a while ago now, but the group continues to meet because it's a ever-evolving piece of work. It's quite impressive in terms of all the different aspects of it. If you haven't looked at the strategy, I suggest you do. I'm talking about one big piece, which I think probably is the biggest piece in there, which was the early career framework. And then shortly after, they announced the core content framework that I was asked to chair. The idea being that those two things need to join up, so you create that seamless pathway from initial teacher training to early career support. Just to say a little bit about the core content framework, I know it's probably the last thing that people feel like they should be having to deal with in a global pandemic, but I do want to defend it and think it's a good thing. But I think it's therefore important that you understand both what it is and what it isn't. And I think some of the criticisms it's had are because people are thinking it's trying to do more than it actually is meant to do. James will agree, he was on the group. It's not meant to be a full curriculum. We spent so much time on this introduction. We kind of knew people wouldn't read it because we don't read them ourselves. But actually, it's as important as the document itself that you read it and you see it's not a curriculum. It doesn't give us any notion of sequence. It doesn't include everything that you should have included in an ITT programme. It's there to provide that coherence and that consistency into the early career framework. That's the most important thing. So we're kind of working back from the early career framework, and the left-hand column of how the body of the document is organised is identical to the early career framework. That sets out the knowledge. And like I say, it doesn't include absolutely everything you would have in ITE. The point is to lay a foundation so that then when the national rollout of the early career framework starts from next September, which is why the core content framework has to be implemented now, there's enough there, there's enough basis that they can really maximise the benefit from what they get as NQTs and RQTs. And if that works, if we can make it work, then you've got a minimum entitlement of at least 3 years of ongoing support and development, which I think goes a long way. It's not everything that's needed, but it goes a long way to support that retention problem and hopefully make teachers want to stay in the profession and feel supported and feel like they're continuing developing their practice. So it's that Velcroing, that's a picture of Velcro there, with the ECF that for me is the most important thing to understand. So I've been speaking to quite a lot of groups, both of providers and of mentors and of school leaders. And from the feedback that I get when I speak to them, some early anecdotal impressions in terms of how it's going down. You'll have noticed I've already hammered that framework, not a curriculum message. It does need to be emphasised, but most people welcome it when they realise that it's a framework. You know, your dearly held curriculum that you already have will probably be covering the framework already. So it's not meant to replace that. Your curriculum will have all that sequencing, will have all that mix of different kinds of knowledge and experience, and will reflect the context and the needs of your trainees and your schools. That sequencing and that crafting of the experience is absolutely fundamental, and just looking at the framework will not do that for you. You have to do that yourself. For some people, I don't think this is a massive deal, but there's some of the terminology about working memory and things is less familiar. But we do stress in the framework the importance of critical analysis. So actually, if there is unfamiliar terminology or terminology that you don't think is that valid in the classroom, I don't think there is anything there, but some people do. You know, there's an encouragement to be critically reflective and to critique the evidence base, and to do a lot of comparing and contrasting. All that stuff that I said really helps concept skill building and that bigger picture. We also put a lot of emphasis in the right-hand column, which is the bit that's different from the early career framework, on what happens in school, because 2/3 of the time is spent there, and we know that's where, you know, it can really make or break. That's often why when people leave, that's often to do with school experience, but often also when they make massive progress, it's to do with the quality of the support they get in school. And we know the mentor is important, but we also know a good mentor also brings in lots of expertise from elsewhere in the school and actually beyond the school. So we use this word expert colleague, which I'll just say a little bit more about now. And this is not a comprehensive list of all the people who might be expert colleagues. It's just an illustrative set of examples. But a good mentor will facilitate conversations with their trainee with all these other people potentially. In the primary context, obviously subject leaders are incredibly important, and having some time, even if it's just conversations with subject leaders, but ideally spending time observing them teach, maybe observing them leading meetings, etc. Really, really helpful. We also, though, stress the importance of some of those external people, the ITE tutor, the dissertation supervisor, you know, being a really important source of expertise and knowledge, and often able to help with that bigger picture kind of conversation that my study found to be so important. So just then to finish by putting the core content framework into the kind of broader context of the recruitment and retention strategy. So I mentioned the early career framework and the importance of those two being very kind of closely working together. But there are other things that I think are really exciting that I'm just going to finish by sharing with you. Hopefully this is on your radar already, but I suggest you get it really firmly on your radar if you're only kind of half aware of it. We've got all the NPQs, the National Professional Qualifications, which have existed for a long time now, are all being revised, and they're all up for tender. So people who currently deliver them will only be able to continue delivering them if they're successful in bidding for them, and that process is about to begin. In doing that, the framework for them all has been quite drastically revised to create a much greater coherence. So they're all following a similar set of frameworks to the core content framework and the early career framework, obviously appropriately adjusted for the level they're meant to reflect. But then at the same time, the bit that probably will most interest this audience is the specialist NPQs. So these are new NPQs that are coming in, and you can see here on the right hand column here are all the ones that already exist that have been revised. The first 3 columns are the new ones, and the leading teacher development one is the one I'm most excited about, and I'll just say a little bit about that. So a teacher developer, I think it is set up as a school-based qualification. There was a question at the USEC conference the other day, could people working in ITT take them? And I think I would certainly encourage that be possible. I don't see why it isn't, but I would need to find out. But it is mainly for school-based people that this is thought about. And it's not thought that every mentor, whoever mentors a trainee or an NQT, would be a teacher developer MPQ person, but that it should be something that maybe a lot of them would aspire to do, and it would be particularly relevant for somebody who's a bit experienced as a mentor, maybe has oversight of other mentors in a school or sometimes across schools. Certainly I know in our school direct partners we have a lot of people who would fulfil this description of this role, so they might be overseeing ITT across the whole of that school direct partnership. Very often they also are involved with the NQTs. Very often they're also involved with other aspects of CPD. So fantastic thing that we've got this, what I think will be a really good qualification for these people. And the idea is it's sort of signalling alternative career pathways. So not only it'll be really helpful for ITT in terms of we'll have people who are better qualified, better recognised, hopefully, have status as a result of having this qualification. So it's going to support ITT and the early career framework, but it also, I think, will help with retention in that people like me, I might have stayed in teaching in the school system if I had the opportunity to take a pathway like this. I came out and into HE actually at the point when I had a baby and I needed to work part-time. Working part-time in school wasn't particularly attractive, and I was also ready for a bit of a change. This would have been enough of a change for me, and I probably could have done it actually part-time as well. So I think in terms of retention, I'm hoping it will hold on to some people who might otherwise have gone away. So I've no idea how I'm doing for time, so I'm completely lost track of it. I think I'm okay, aren't I? So that's me come to the end of my slides now. So rather than leaving that up, stop sharing, which I can't find. Is it that one? Yes. Oh. So I hope
well done. That was brilliant.
You a
really,
round
really
of applause. I have to say, it's always delightful.
Thank you.
Lovely. Okay. Yeah, I mean, gosh, so much and really fascinating insights into teacher expertise, the models that we then would try to promote within schools vis-a-vis the skill builders. I think that's just fantastic stuff. It really is, and so relevant as well. Okay, so I'm going to quickly open that up. I'm sure there's lots of comments and questions for you, Sam, as well. Again, we don't have the chat, so just put your hand on the facility or start with your question. Who would like to start us off?
Stunned everybody into silence.
Stunned.
I'm probably thinking about lunch as well.
No. Oh, there's, yeah, Elaine's got her hand up first. So Elaine.
I thought it was really fascinating. I really like the idea of how to categorise different behaviours in a way that are main development phases for students, but not just for students. I'm sitting there thinking of my own practice, thinking, oh yeah, I know that session. I know what I was doing in that session. The other thing is, I'm going to be mean now, but you are part of government advisory panels and things anyway. It sounds great. I love the idea that you're going to have support after you finish your training. Is there going to be money? Will it work? Will people have funding?
Absolutely excellent question, and the most important question. I mean, it's funded. It is funded to an extent. So we're involved in partnership with Education Development Trust in the pilot, and I'm assuming, I think the same model will work for the national rollout. The actual pilot course, if you like, the thing that NQTs get sent on, is funded. Schools don't have to pay for it. NQTs don't have to pay for it. And the mentor training that accompanies it is funded to the point, as in you don't have to pay to do it.
Okay.
What we're still arguing about, and to be honest, I don't know where they've ended up, is whether the release time for mentors, both to go on the training and to do the job, is funded. I've been pushing really, really strongly for that. But you'd want it to be funded for ITT as well. Otherwise, there's a danger that you'd actually siphon off all your good mentors to just focus on early career teachers, because that's funded in ITT, isn't it? So there's an issue there. I don't know. I imagine for the national rollout, those arguments are still being had. The DFE, as James said, I mean, I'm not here to defend DFE because they do mad things sometimes, but the people I've been working with have understood that argument and have been trying very hard with Treasury to get that funded. I don't know. I think probably the spending review is still the point at which we know whether they've won that battle or not.
Yeah, I just think it makes so much sense, you know, to give people a support and a new career path, you know, for people that have been teaching for longer. As you said, you would perhaps have stayed in the classroom, but there's a lot of teachers who might get to a pitch where they're a bit, this is a terrible thing to say, a bit bored with the day job and think they could do something else, and they don't want to be a head and they don't want to be the deputy. They might not even want to be a subject leader, but training other teachers might be something that really would interest them and make good use of their expertise, especially if they've become that expert teacher. You don't want to lose them.
Exactly. That's why I said I could relate to it. I think it was a little bit of boredom, but it's just a sense of being trapped in your own classroom and really enjoying the opportunity to get out into other people's classrooms and see other people's practice. And in doing that you develop your own practice as well. The MPQs will be funded according to certain criteria that are still being developed. So again, I think there'll be a question between funded because you don't have to pay for the course, as opposed to funded for the release time to do it. And I suspect the latter won't be funded, but the former might be, but only according to certain criteria. So probably not for everybody. That's still being discussed, I think. But I know what you were saying doesn't just apply to the MPQs; it applies more broadly as well.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, and really good answer as well. Very encouraging for the profession, Sam, as well. Those progressional pathways, lovely. Tracy, your hands up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Sam. Thanks very much for your presentation. Really found that interesting. We were delighted last night to have our strategic partnership group meet with us, and we were able to show them a document that we've developed to support our mentors in school. Be happy to share that with you. I know you're really busy, but
no, I'd love to. I'd love you to. If you could send it to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Okay, it is in draft, so excuse. There's all sorts of yellow highlights and comments all over it at the moment. We've asked our partners to look at that and see how it will work for them, what else they want from us. So your presentation has really got me thinking, oh, now I know I want to add this in, I want to add this explanation in. So thank you so much for that. Just a question really for me, it's a little bit of a personal one. And it's around the early career framework and those students who are taking a PGDE as opposed to a PGCE, who of course will be continuing with their masters into their NQT year, and it comes really from my daughter, who's despite all of my protestations and trying to discourage her, decided to go and train to teach, and so she's in the middle of that at the moment, and she is on a PGD, and unfortunately overheard a comment in a staff meeting where the head teacher or the lead teacher there said, we won't be employing any of the PGDEs, only the school directs, because we're doing the early career framework. So there is, and that this is one of the early pilot schools up north, and I think there are some misconceptions, and actually the thought being that they can't do their NQT year, the ECF, and continue their masters all at the same time. And I just wondered if you've got any guidance, any thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's a whole load of different sort of misconceptions potentially in there. So if she's doing a PGDE and it's teach first,
it's not teach first, it's with a provider.
So normally PGDE you would still finish at the end of a year anyway. So it's interesting that you've got one that's carrying on into the second year like that. Absolutely no reason why you can't do both. I mean, the reason why I mentioned teach first is they are also one of the pilot providers, and they are obviously thinking particularly about their own trainees who will be NQTs in the second year of their programme, and they have aligned the early career framework, that their version of it, to that master's study, so that they're completely compatible, and should complement each other. But you can sort of understand why schools are confused, can't you? So there is something there.
Your understanding, your interpretation, because it's exactly mine, that actually, it's a misconception.
Yeah, it's well worth knowing though. I will pass that message on to DFE colleagues, because we don't, that's the last thing we want to happen.
Thank you. Thanks for your advice.
you, Tracy, for your really good question. Robert, and welcome and good morning, fellow NaPTEC committee member Robert Young. What's your question, please, Robert?
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Oh, yes, loud and clear, Robert.
That's great. Yeah, I've been around a long time, and in fact, I entered the teaching profession way back in 1967, and I therefore found your talk particularly illuminating for a variety of reasons, but in particular because of your focus on the developmental continuum for teachers, which seems to me to be a very helpful way of thinking about teacher development. I wonder whether, looking at the developments in the profession over the decades, certainly since the 1970s, have there been some very critical pressures from the centre, from the government, towards a model of teaching, which in fact is much closer to the curriculum deliverer than the concept skill builder. I'm thinking not just of the introduction of the national curriculum and the particular models in the national curriculum that we were all working to in the 80s and 90s in particular, but I'm also thinking about the impact of high stakes testing in the primary school, which is so pervasive in terms of its impact on what's happening and the nature of the curriculum that is having to be prioritized, particularly in year 6 and indeed earlier in year 2. And it's you've also got the recent introduction of the multiplication tables testing procedure, which again is likely to, and indeed is already, I think, impacting on the nature of teaching of mathematics. So while on the one hand, you're arguing for a model which emphasizes the importance of teachers developing their skills and qualities as concept skill builders, is it still the case that there are central pressures that are working against it?
Such a good set of questions and comments. I'm actually halfway through reading a PhD that I'm examining, which is making it absolutely the case that you've just made, going right back from the 1940s, but particularly with the focus on assessment. And I think the high stakes nature of assessment linked to accountability is one of the biggest issues here. I personally don't think the sort of centralisation of a curriculum in itself automatically leads to curriculum delivery. I think, although I think when it first comes in, it can do. Speaking as somebody who was an NQT in the very first year of the very first national curriculum, you know, you needed a wheelbarrow to kind of take the curriculum around with you, didn't you? Remember all those folders and things? Absolutely. And definitely, you know, there was a not being able to see the wood for the trees sort of process that we all went through. But then we did go through it, I think, and get to a point where we could see the wood for the trees, and it actually was helpful in terms of having that sense of coherence and consistency, to have something that, compared to when I was doing my PGC, where there was no consistency between the various different schools and the various different curricula, and it was all topic work, some of which was good and some which wasn't. So I think having some kind of centralisation and sense of coherence is helpful, but definitely there's a balance where you get too much, you can't see the wood for the trees. But then when you also bring in that high stakes assessment that goes along with it, against which, you know, teachers and schools are judged, that's when it skews everything. And this PhD is very, very strongly, clearly sort of evidencing that, which is a slightly different argument to whether or not we should have anything that's centralised. I know you weren't necessarily arguing we shouldn't. For me, it does justify the approach that we took with the core content framework, and why I need to emphasise it's a framework, not a curriculum. It's quite minimal, really. There are lots of things that I think are very dear and important to ITE, and you know, for this audience in particular, child development being a really important one that's not mentioned in the framework. But that's because you need to develop the curriculum around it, and I think providers having that ability to reflect their own context, their own sets of expertise, their own trainees, their own schools is good. You know, it's quite empowering. So for me, that strikes a good balance between having something that's sufficiently coherent and consistent, that you could train in one part of the country and be in an NQT in another part, and you recognise enough that you can build on that sort of spiral curriculum kind of experience, while also recognising that different providers and different schools have different needs. That's the balance that we're trying to strike. So I feel I can defend that, but what I can't defend is what's happened with the rest of the system, and particularly that, you know, the accountability and the link to that, and very narrow assessment tools, which are all about performativity rather than necessarily deeper understanding. Totally agree.
Yeah, I sort of I agree with you. That I've always been a staunch defender of the notion of a national curriculum. I think that was an important moment, really, when it was introduced to the primary education. But it's the particular model that emerged subsequently was, in some respects, very destructive. And I think we've moved a long way since then. Yeah.
And there is, I mean, it will always be, unfortunately, seems to be subject to sort of political interference and ideology.
Yes.
Thing that, you know, we often moan about when we gather together in occasions like this. You know, everybody's an expert in education because they went to school. And unfortunately, you get that with ministers a lot, don't you?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Great question as well, Robert. That's really good. Just scrolling down. Has anyone else perhaps got maybe a final question for Sam before we?
I won't be offended if people want to just go and get their lunches.
Yeah, no, that was absolutely excellent. Absolutely excellent, Sam. I really enjoyed that. I think it was absolutely fascinating. And you've raised questions about the future for us as well, which of course is bang on with the theme of today, to be quite honest. Yes, we have got challenges, but how can we weave our way through those to create something that's better, that's more diverse, that has got different pathways, and still concentrate on that importance of high quality teachers concentrating on high quality learning. I mean, it's just fantastic. So goodness, I hope you still find time amongst your many busy arrangements to help with that and steer us in the right direction in the national picture for us there as well. So on behalf of everybody today, may I just thank you. That's been fascinating, and I'd love to hear about your early research as well. That's really great. That it's just made me think of some work I'm doing at the moment with mentors in schools, and I just think let's go back to that. That's a really good model of getting mentors to think about what's important when they're observing lessons and what's important for their trainees that they're trying to promote excellence wise. So very important stuff there. Lovely. I'm sure you're exhausted now. That's a long time on a screen, but just fantastic. And yes, we would be delighted to invite you back next year if you would come and visit us. We hope to be in St Hughes. That's the plan. But lovely, and enjoy the rest of your day, and our grateful thanks once again. It's been fascinating. Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Thank you. Lovely. Okay, everybody.